Today we're going to be breaking down a hand I played against popular YouTube vlogger Ethan Rampage Yau. This hand happened in one of my heads-up matches at Poker at the Lodge. I haven't had one of these matches in a while, but I have a slightly higher stakes one than this happening against TJ Reed over on Poker at the Lodge. You can head over there and check it out. On that note, let's go ahead and jump into the action. Our hand begins with Ethan looking down at pocket twos on the button and raising 2.5x, certainly the standard play here with pocket twos. Now over to me in the big blind, I see 9-5 suited. You're always going to defend this hand. The question is, should you 3-bet or not? Typically speaking, this hand definitely prefers to call, but may occasionally mix in some 3-bets every now and then. Let's take a look at the actual answer. This is what a heads up open range looks like on the button. You can see it's about 85% of all hands or 83% of all hands. And now after the raise pre, we then look at the defend range. 9-5 suited is going to be a hand that calls 88% of the time and 3-bets to 12% of the time. So basically, when you're playing, you can decide to only flat this. You're not going to lose that much value. You can 3-bet every once in a while. That's fine too. You just need to make sure you're not going too crazy with a hand like 9-5 suited. I will also note that if we switch over to 100 big blind play and we look what a raise does, we see 9-5 suited actually gets 3-bet much more often. So as you get shorter, this hand 3-bets more. As you get deeper, it 3-bets a little bit less often, which makes sense because it's not a hand that really makes the nuts on almost any board. I decide this time we're going to raise and I make it $200 to go. It's probably more optimal to go 190 or 195 or 185, but I don't want my opponents to think I'm some kind of goddamn nerd. So I make it 200 straight. Back over to Ethan with pocket twos. This hand always going to be a call, which he decides to call, and let's go ahead and take a flop. Huge flop here for Ethan, flopping bottom set against a 3-better in position on a board that's pretty hard to have hands. Let's take a little look at the range breakdown so we can understand why this board is hard to have hands. Here we see the strategy for out of position on the flop here in a 3-bet pot. And as you can see, if you 3-bet and get this flop, you're betting pretty much every time. I know it says 19% check here in Lucid, but once betting gets above 80% frequency, you can typically bet your entire range and suffer very little EV loss, and it makes your life much simpler to play. The opposite is also true when it gets under 20%. You can check your range, typically speaking, without losing much value. Just a couple thresholds for you to be aware of. So we see that we can bet our entire range here. Lots of sizes get in the mix. We can see 1/3 pot, pretty good size, 2/3 pot, also pretty good size, and then even overbetting is a good size. Basically, in the big blind here, you get to go ham. The way I approach this, I use single size in these spots to make my life easy. And so I'm going to bet 2/3 pot on the flop here with all of my hands, which I do decide to go ahead and do. Over to Rampage now, taking a look at his range. We can now see what it's like for the player in position with pocket twos. And you can see the major problem. The weakest offsuit hands you tend to call pre-flop are offsuit 9s. And this board is 8 high, meaning you really do not have many pairs of 8s, 3s, or deuces in your range pre. Yes, you can have ace 8, you can have some suited hands, but all of the offsuit 2s, all of the offsuit 3s are folding, and then almost all of the offsuit 8s are folding. So this is a situation where in position is just kind of screwed. The big blind gets to bet aggressively, and then you have to deal with what you have there. Now, against the 2/3 pot size, we can see pocket twos is actually raising about half the time or a third of the time. Typically speaking, the worst hand to slow play is bottom set, because when you have bottom set, you gain the most value by raising. You unblock lots of higher paired hands that can call you. So typically speaking, we want to raise and get value when we have bottom set, and then hands like pocket 8s, you can see, are always calling. So with bottom set here, I don't mind a raise, and then you work in some bluffs with hands like ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited, maybe some 9-6 suited backdoor flush draw, some 9-5 suited backdoor flush draw. Basically hands that can't quite call or have some good removal effects, and then of course our value bets. We do also see 10s and 9s raising on the flop, which of course feels a little bit awkward to be doing, but it does make some sense as well. Ethan decides he's going to go ahead and just call, set the trap, and we take a turn. The turn comes the 9 of spades, creating a backdoor flush draw. I turn top pair, but I am drawing stone dead, as our commentator Greg Potter notes.
Doug's going to turn top pair, but he's drawing stone dead.
Thanks, Greg. Always good to know when you're drawing dead. Also, Rampage, not a huge fan of the $5 chips being bet because, again, it's some nerd shit. Anyway, the question now, what do we do here on this turn overcard? Well, typically speaking, when you 3-bet, bet the flop, and the turn is an overcard, it's a very good card for the 3-better pre-flop because you have way more overcard hands that can bet the flop. However, in position does have a few hands here that improve as well. Let's take a look at the answer. On the turn 9 here, there's a backdoor flush draw. I know the suits are slightly different, but I made it match where it's the club or rather the suit of the 9 matches the deuce. So it is the same board, just slightly different suits being chosen. But regardless, let's take a look at the strategy. We can see the out-of-position player does basically only one of 2 things. You either check or you bomb it. 44.27 into 43.8, basically betting pot. And the idea here really is when I have an overpair in this spot, or rather when you have an overpair in this spot, you want to try and play for all of the money. There are very, very, very few 2-pair and 3-of-a-kind hands for your opponent. And so you bet big, and then that allows you to bluff the maximal amount of the time. If we take a look at the amounts of hands we have, we can see we have plenty of overpairs in our range here. We have plenty of high card hands in our range here. And we look at what bets. We can go down to 9-5 suited. And we can see that when we do have 9-5 suited in this situation, we're typically going to be betting about, let's say, 50% of the time or so. Now, this is using a 29.3 size. We would just use the big size or check. But the point is this hand is pretty indifferent between the 2 decisions. Generally speaking, in spots like this, I'm going to randomize between my 2 options, do some checking, do some betting. There's definitely merit both ways. If you bet, you can get value from 8x, backdoor clubs, straight draws, hands like pocket 6s might float, maybe hands like ace, queen, ace, jack float. So there's definitely hands to get some value from. But you also start to make this pot very big and narrow your opponent's range so much that you actually are ahead of less of their range. So this hand is right in the middle, doesn't mind betting, doesn't mind checking. We decide we're going to go ahead and bet. After using the large size, we can now go over to our opponent's strategy here, and we can see the way that they react. On this turn barrel, you can go ahead and just never raise. Once raising gets under 5%, it's usually not that necessary to even have raises at all. So with a 3% raise frequency here in the top right, it's pretty unnecessary for us to want to raise. So in this situation, the question is purely, do we want to call or fold? With Rampage's hand pocket 2s, obviously it's a call, because our hand is basically the nuts. But just looking at a few other hands, we can see ace queen does go ahead and fold here primarily on the turn. We can see we're folding hands like 7s, 6s, 5s, 4s, probably because you're blocking some of the straight draws that you want to have in there. We are continuing to float when we have hands like jack 10, always calling the turn. Queen jack, if we floated the flop, we're now floating the turn. Jack 10 suited, queen 10 suited when it's clubs. You know, all of the 9x hands, all of the 8x hands. And if you did have a hand like ace 3 or queen 3, you're going to be doing a little bit of both. So kind of obvious the way we play. It's a very large barrel. We're going to fold about half the time. We're going to call about half the time, which Ethan does decide to go ahead and do. And let's take a river. The river comes in offsuit 7, which means it is an awesome time to head on over now to upswingpoker.com for $25 off Lucid Poker. Available only for the next couple of days. $25 off a month, which is $49 normally, so only $24 for 1 month, or our annual package. You hop in now, you can train on the trainer I've used to train in my matches along the way to improve my poker game. For more information, you can check out the live streams on my channel. I battled it out where you can see just how bad I really am. So head on over now to upswingpoker.com and use code LUCID25 today. Okay, so back to the hand in question. After barreling the turn and getting a call, the question is, how do we want to play our top pair on the river? I think that it is not particularly close here. I think we want to just be playing a check in this spot. If we decide to use some block bets, which I think would be fine, we would go for a small size here. So if we want to play 1/3 pot or jam, this hand might actually like a 1/3 every now and then, but generally speaking, when we have the situation where we have a top pair weak kicker, 200 blinds deep, you don't want to just be shoveling in all of the money. I know it's heads up. I know it's top pair, but at some point you got to slow down and try and allow your opponent some room to bluff. So we decided to go ahead and check the river, and now Rampage has the easiest all-in of all time, which he does decide to go ahead and make. A very well played hand from Rampage here. There weren't really very many tough decisions, but he certainly nailed all of them along the way. Back over to me with 9-5, and we all know what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull up the machine to tell us what we should have been doing. So when we check the river here and face an all-in jam from the small blind, by the way, some of the bluffs that we're looking at in Rampage's shoes here are going to be hands such as, let's say, Queen 10 if you double floated, Queen Jack if you double floated, Ace 5, Ace 4 if you double floated, although maybe a little bit less Ace 5. Perhaps we're also jamming with 5-4 suited that called twice. That makes sense. Or 6-4 suited of clubs. Those are going to be our main bluffs, as well as some club hands like King 4 suited, King 5 suited. Basically, If you've got a middling ace high or better, you're going to check here. Otherwise, you're going all in, and your thinnest value bet is generally speaking going to be somewhere around ace 9 for a full jam. King 9 would prefer a 87 big blind size. We're actually not going to use that here. We're going to be playing jam or check. So at somewhere around Jack 9, Queen 9, we're going to check back on the river. Although you don't really have that many of those because you'd have to call the flop bet. So it's really just the backdoor flush draw 9s. Anyway, he does decide to jam. Now back over to my strategy here. The question is, how thin do we call? We can see that any 9 is mainly calling this jam. Any suited 9 is definitely calling. A couple of the queen 9s are going to fold when you have bad suits. For example, you don't really want a club here because you block some of the hands that can float twice. So we can see king 9, king of clubs actually folds the river. Queen 9, queen of clubs folds the river. For some reason, having the spade, I don't know. I don't know why the spade. I don't know everything. But the point is, when you 3-bet and you turn top pair after c-betting the flop, you're probably ending up calling down. It's simply going to be a hand that is too strong to do anything else. Now, you might note, it doesn't have 9-5 suited here. It's because the solver is splitting its range where I am playing it in a single size. So I would have this here and the solver would not. But the big takeaway is we're going to be calling some 9s down. Now, the more I think about this, I actually think 9-5 might be a fold if we're going to fold any 9s, because you block ace 5, you block 5-4 suited, 2 of the main bluff hands. So I'm going to go ahead and say this call was not particularly great, but at the end of the day, when you have top pair heads up, sometimes you just got to put in all the money.
Is polarized to either a very strong hand or a bluff. And you really want to have card removal to the strongest hands.
Obviously.
And he does make the call.
All right.
Rampage Poker getting paid off.
Thanks for joining me today for this breakdown. I'll see you over at Poker at the Lodge. And if you want $25 off Lucid Poker, you can check out the link in the description below. This offer will expire Sunday night, Monday morning, somewhere in that range. Peace, guys.